Good evening, everyone. Some familiar faces, some new faces. I will not bore you with all the text which is up on the slides. All of you can read. I think what I want to basically get across tonight is we at Sphere Medical, what are we about? And where does a product, which is called Proxima, actually fit into clinical practice? And why will it make a difference if people adopt the product going forward? So Proxima is our lead product. It is an innovative monitoring diagnostic device which we sell into the critical care setting. Now, critical care setting is where you can see the sickest of the sick patients. We're talking about intensive care unit, we're talking about an operating theater, potentially also emergency department. So we are not aiming with this product at the market of, let's say, a person in a hospital on a ward or potentially even, let's say, home care. And I think that's an important take-home message for you today. Why do we have this product? Now, people in the hospital, if you are in critical care, they do frequent blood sampling. And that's required to manage your critically ill, unstable patients. That means the patient, the physiology, they change very quickly. They can deteriorate, improve in a short space of time. And if you don't measure very frequently, you have no idea where the patient actually is. And therefore, let's say this is very vital information for the clinician to be able to understand and manage the patient's physiology. Now, current solutions, and I'll be briefly talking about some of them as well, they have barriers to frequent measurements. Now, we with Proxima have a patient-connected device which removes all those barriers, and we will briefly touch on those points also later on in the presentation, in that it provides better patient management during that critically ill, unstable phase of the patient, while at the same time we reduce the nurse workload to actually do the measurements. You get faster, more frequent results to actually know what's going on with the patient, and at the same time we avoid blood loss, which is one of the big things that you'll see is if you do frequent measurements, quite a lot of blood gets discarded and patients become anemic. And also it reduces the infection risks. So this is what Proxima is essentially all about. So if you look at how people are doing it nowadays, this is actually the blood gas and electrolytes are the most frequent diagnostic test you will do in a hospital. And there are key indicators of how well your lungs and your kidneys are doing. And again, if your lungs are doing well, you get enough oxygen, your brain and your organs function well. If that no longer works well, okay, you start getting into trouble. If you don't get rid of your CO2 properly, you become acidic. That can cause cell damage. And you know that also sort of can lead to organ failure if you don't react to that quickly enough. On average, people take a measurement every 3 to 4 hours in the critical care setting by drawing blood with a syringe. So they take a first syringe. Now that blood is not pure. It's sort of mixed with some kind of saline. So it doesn't really give you a real reading of what's going in the patient, so people discard that. Then they take a second syringe of that blood and they take that to the blood gas analyzer to get the readings. Now that's, on average, can be between 7 and 10 milliliters of blood you lose every time you do a measurement. And for critically ill patients, people can actually measure up to 19 measurements a day. That's almost every 1.5 hours. That's pretty frequent, actually. And once the nurse has taken that sample, they leave the patient because they have to walk to the closest blood gas analyzer, which can be close by, but of course be pretty far away. You also open up the arterial line from which you draw the blood. Now, opening up the arterial line and closing it can introduce infections. And if you actually introduce an infection into the arterial line, that's very bad news for the patient. So people would want to limit the opening and closing of arterial lines. And then you have a blood sample, which could be also infectious. A patient could have flu, could even have Ebola, something. But you do not want to have infectious blood being moved around the hospital and then potentially that infection being spread to other patients. But by moving that blood from the patient to the blood gas analyzer, it could sort of infect the blood gas analyzer and you not properly wipe it down. Another nurse comes who does her measurement, picks up that germ, takes it back to her patient. So that way you can start spreading actually nasty things within the hospital. So these are the drawbacks as to why people say, well, it would be great to measure more often because I understand what my patient is doing, But there's a real heavy price that I have to pay because the nurses are continually moving around, not being vetted by the patient. You're continuously opening and closing arterial lines, and you have that infectious blood which moves around. So Proxima is a patient-attached disposable device which we mount directly into the arterial line. And by that we have a closed system. By the closed system we mean you do not take blood out of the system, and all the blood, once you do the measurement, you return that back to the patient. Therefore, we also reduce the blood loss. So there's no blood loss if you measure with Proxima. Once you connect it to the patient, this device can move with the patient wherever the patient goes. You can think of it, let's say the patient comes in and has a planned surgery. You can fit the device to the patient, monitor the patient during the surgery, leave the device on the patient, monitor the patient in the recovery room and also potentially also in the ICU. So you have a continual history of how the patient is doing throughout the entire episode of care. You connect the data at the patient bedside, so the nurse doesn't have to leave the bedside when she does the measurement, and it's easy to actually do more frequent measurements. And it's a multi-use disposable approved for up to 72-hour use, so you can do as many measurements as you want within a 72-hour period. Now, on average, I mean, the most frequent that we have seen out there in hospitals is that maybe every 15 minutes a blood gas is taken if a patient is in a very critical state. Normally you'd see an hour, 2 hours, and then maybe at some stage the patient starts to stabilize and it goes to 3 to 4 hours. So we've done some time and motion. We're collecting data as we go along, as we trial Proxima within the market. And if you were to do a measurement on average, these are average numbers which we collected from hospitals. This is not one specific hospital, by the way. But on average, if you were to do a measurement every 3 hours, the nurse over a 72-hour period, would spend 3 hours just doing blood gases. Nothing else, just 3 hours pure time. If, for some other reason, that patient is so sick, you do not want to leave that patient alone, you have to find a second nurse who will look after the patient while the first nurse is away from the bedside doing the blood gas measurement. So that number actually goes up to 6. And you can see the nurse is actually on average about 2 hours away from the bed. In terms of blood loss, what you see is about 125 milliliters of blood is being lost for those measurements. You open the arterial line about 48 times, and 24 times you actually transport blood within the hospital. Now, if I were to increase that frequency to do a measurement every 2 hours, you see, these numbers start to go up in terms of nursing workload, blood loss. And remember, 1 unit of blood is 250 milliliters. So what you can basically see, this patient will lose 1 unit of blood, and you have to transfuse that blood. That's expensive on the one hand, but also some patients actually react not very well if you infuse blood to them. And again, all the numbers sort of say, and if I do a measurement every hour, that becomes even worse. So you can understand why there's a resistance to measure more frequently in the hospital. But on the other hand, it makes clinical sense because you want to know what's going on with your patient. So with Proxima, if we were to measure every 2 hours, you can see the nursing workload comes down from 5 hours to 3 hours. There is no cover needed, and the nurse doesn't go away from the bed. Again, you can see no blood loss, significant reduction in the number of times you open the arterial line, again, and we know don't move the blood around. So we are actually actively addressing those big barriers as to why people do not measure blood more frequently in the ICU or in the operating theater. Now, we recently performed a study in the University Hospital of Southampton to take a look. These were sort of, let's say, average numbers that we see in hospitals. If we were to go up in a very sort of competitive environment, i.e. they've been very well organized, they have a high ratio of blood gases to beds, so, and the path from the bed, from the patient to the blood gas analyzer is very short, so you would expect that the total time to actually do a measurement is going to be fairly short. We said, right, let's go up on a challenge. And we did a randomized study, 20 patients recruited, 10 went on Proxima, and 10 were doing the conventional way of doing a blood gas, i.e. taking the syringe and going to the blood gas analyzer. On average, what we did is we made 10 measurements over a period of 24 hours. And what the results actually show is that there's a statistically significant reduction in more than 20% of the total time it takes for a sample. And again, this is already an extremely optimized system. We came in, we trained the nurses, they've seen the system for the first time, we've trained them for 90 minutes, and already they can be better than the best optimal system which is out there. And again, there's also more than 50% in reduction of delay of start of testing. So what this means is that you take a device which is new, you give it to people, we've trained them basically, already they can do much, much better than a well-trained organization. Just imagine what happens if they adopt that and that actually gets sort of rolled out on a routine basis. Those numbers will come down even further. And if you then go into a hospital which is not as well equipped as this one, and then most of the hospitals are not as well equipped as this one, those numbers will be even more impressive. And interesting enough, on average, a nurse spent time away for an average 3 minutes from the bedside. Now you think, okay, what's that? 10 times 3 minutes, that's half an hour. In the first 24 hours after the patient was discharged from cardiac surgery, i.e. these were the sickest of the sick, open heart surgery, aortic valve replacements, bypasses, what have you. You actually don't have anybody looking after that patient for half an hour in those first 24 hours. It's actually frightening. And again, what this study shows is what I showed you previously. That's not just theory, this is reality. And as I said, this study actually beautifully confirms our value proposition. Now, which market are we in? Currently, the market is estimated to be around 1.4 billion in 2014 and growing at 10% per annum. And it's estimated to be about 3.5 billion by the year 2023. Now, where does that come from? As people get more older, they tend to have some kind of, let's say, disease. They get sent to the hospital, they get treated. So the number of blood gases that have to be done, they increase. And this is where the growth in the market essentially is coming from. It's from the aging population and the increased disease burden that you hear being talked about every day. When you turn on the news in the morning, there's something about the NHS and the hospital not coping. So you can see this increased burden rolling at our healthcare system. And if you look at Proxima in its end game, not where we are today, in its end game, we think we can get to a global potential revenue potential of more than $200 million per annum. And this is directly proportional to the number of patients you're going to use Proxima on. Normally, you would have one disposable per patient during the care in the ICU. And again, the ASP that we're looking at is fixed. So we don't charge per test, we would charge per patient. And irrespective of the number of measurements you do, and again, the more measurements you do, the cheaper it becomes. Whereas our competition charges per test. So the more measurements you do, the more expensive it becomes. So again, a barrier for doing more frequent measurements. So where are we now? We've launched Proxima 3 into the market, and that is essentially measuring the blood gases hematocrit and potassium. We can use them on patients who have respiratory kind of diseases. ECMO is a very special respiratory disease, and we can only use it on adults. And we can think maybe 10, maximum 20% of the patients in an ICU we can treat with that. With Proxima 4, that's the device we recently received the CE mark for. That increases while we're adding sodium and glucose, and we can then increase the number of patients because we now can address something that's called glycemic control. This has got nothing to do with diabetes. Patients in an ICU, they have their glucose measurements, they go up and down when they are struggling to recover. And you actually have to have a very accurate measurement of where you are, because otherwise, if you get that wrong, a patient can actually die. Again, we're talking about cardiac surgery. And what is important is we're also adding pediatrics. Now, that's children 3 years and older we can add to the device. So what you can see is we are moving up. So we can potentially connect this device to far more patients than we do right now. And then obviously we just want to continue down the route. And there's a parameter called lactate, which you are seeing is used more often now in clinical use. By adding that, again, we can go after something which is called sepsis. Sepsis is actually a very nasty thing. It can look like a flu, and 8 hours later you're dead, because your body goes down in a shutdown mode because the organs start getting increasing stress due to various factors within the body. So you need to detect the onset of sepsis very quickly. And so with that, let's say with this next version, then obviously we will increase the patient population again. So we have a strategy of subsequent product releases with which we then continually grow the patients on which we can actually use the device, and thereby sort of then starting to grow the sales that come with it. Already talked about that on Proxima 3. What we do is we launched that already sort of 1.5 years back. We have direct salespeople who went directly to people, early adopters in the market, to get some feedback on the product. With Proxima 4, we've got the CE mark. We plan to launch that later this year. And what we then want to do is we want to convert that into our commercial engine and drive up revenues. And what we've done is you might have picked up that we signed a distributor in Italy, a company called Burke & Burke in June. It's the first of a list of distributors we're trying to sign up so that we can get a broad enough commercial base out there to really start ramping up sales. And again, Proxima 4 is something that we aim to deliver, sort of hopefully in about a year's time. And the objective is that we get recurring revenues because the product is being used on a routine basis in the hospitals. Now, we talked about Proxima 3. The key thing was not about sales. The key thing was about understanding how the product works and what feedback we get. And I want to go to this slide on what kind of feedback did we get from the Proxima 3 out there. Now, nurses like the system, how it works, but they don't like the amount of work that's required to actually set up the system. Ideally, they like to be able to set up the system in a much quicker time, or ideally have it automated altogether. Now, you need to understand that blood gases are typically set up by a technician, so not by the nurse, or they're automated. So we're asking the nurse to do something which she hasn't done before. So naturally, they're not too keen on doing something which is new. Whereas taking the blood measurement, she always does that. So what have we done for Proxima 4? We've significantly invested in reducing the setup time, making that much more quicker. But I think in the long term, if you want to get to the millions of patients, we will have to also sort of look at the automation piece. They also said, yes, the system works very well. We can treat some patients with that, but we can't treat enough patients. Now, why is that important? If you learn a new device and you don't have too many patients, you don't use that very frequently, and you can theoretically unlearn. It's like if you drive a car. If you drive them daily, you very quickly become a good driver. If you only drive it once a week or once a month, you remain a fairly sort of rudimentary driver. So theoretically, there are not enough patients for a nurse to become proficient in using Proxima on a day-to-day basis. So they say, if we have a bigger patient group I can use it on, then I use it more routinely and I get more well-versed in using the system. And that's where, by adding glucose to the Proxima 4, we increase that patient group so it should become easier to adopt. And again, with lactate, we add that additional step. Another thing is around clinical trends. Right now, every blood gas analyzer, including Proxima, just shows you the number. We had a pH of 7.43. Now, before that, the value might have been 7.32. Now, okay, two values. One is bigger than the other. But actually, if you see them plotted on a graph, it's very easy to actually see what the patient is doing, whether they're improving, whether they're deteriorating. So people have asked whether it's possible to actually have graphical trending of the values on the system. And again, if you do very frequent measurements, it's easy to forget you have to do a measurement because they are so busy in what they're doing. So they've asked us, well, can you remind us on when the next measurement is actually due? So we are looking into developing some software functionality to be able to schedule measurements, to remind the nurses the next measurement is due, and also to provide that additional value by displaying graphical trends of the data. And finally, connectivity. Now, blood gases are the most frequent diagnostic test done in the hospital, but that's not the only one. You could have some kind of blood culture being done to try and see whether there's some kind of infection. So they want to see all the data that relates to that patient when they do their diagnosis. So being able to see the blood gas data in connection with what they have, all the other data, is very important for them when they actually take their decisions to change the therapy or not. And that's why connecting into an IT system is very, very important for them. And during the year, we already connected two systems called Convox and Clinisys, which are very wide spread systems here in Europe, lab information systems. And we are talking to industry leaders to also look at the patient monitoring side, so that, for instance, we can integrate into a Philips or a GE monitor out there. Right now, where we are, if you look back at our first half of the results, we are continuing to have very tight financial control of our numbers. We had total operating expenses of 2.6 million. And we capitalized product development costs of around 1.1 million. Now, this actually tells us that we believe that the product has commercial potential, because then, according to IFRS, you start capitalizing your R&D costs. And we also see that our CapEx requirements in the near term are also going to be minimal. So we don't see a massive increase of our spend as we go forward. Our cash balance is also better than budget, and the cash in the middle of the year, we were around about 6.6 million pounds, of which 0.6 million were an R&D tax credit that we received. And that's pretty much what we receive every year. And if we continue our development, we will see that, we will expect to see the same amount coming through as well. So, one final slide I'm going to talk about. Where do we see we are from here? Obviously, the next thing we want to do is launch Proxima For sales here in Europe, expected before the end of the year. We also, sort of, as I said, still continue working on talking to additional distributors, trying to sign additional commercialization deals for Proxima 4. We will inform you once Proxima 4 is launched as to sort of the initial traction that we see in terms of sales. If we can get additional clinical evaluation results on the order, we will obviously also then talk about those. And we will also sort of inform you about what progress we're making on our Proxima 4 development progress, especially around, let's say, the trending and the scheduling that I talked about. So, to summarize, with Proxima we have a very unique device. It's a patient-attached, continuous, connected blood gas electrolyte solution, which will give you better patient management during that critical phase when you connect with the patient and he's very unstable. We reduce the nursing workload, we avoid the blood loss, we reduce the infection risk, and we're able to have faster and more frequent production of results. And we think it's a great market potential. We have a clear commercialization strategy. We're executing on that. With Proxima 3, it was all about feedback, understanding the product, improving the product. With 4, we start our commercialization process. We got the CE mark. We plan to launch it later this year. And we've already appointed our first distributor. So with that, thank you and open to questions.
Any questions, anybody? Well, I've got some. Oh, the gentleman down here at the front.
Good evening, Wolfgang.
Hi there.
In your time and motion study you did at Southampton, was that done with Proxima 3 or Proxima 4? I think it was done on Proxima 3 and you just looked at gas levels. Mm-hmm. If you did do it on Proxima 3, is there any plans to repeat it for Proxima 4 and look at electrolyte and glucose levels as well for nurse time?
It was done with Proxima 3 because at that time, we didn't have CE mark, and if you don't have CE mark, you cannot connect it to patients at all. No, I mean that's why sort of you have to sort of keep it away from patients until you have CE marks. Once you have CE mark, you can start connecting to patients. So it was done with 3, but the fundamental value proposition in terms of time and motion between Proxima 3 and 4 is not significant. We see we would see an improvement from 4 to 3, so the numbers should get better, but we see little value to actually repeat it. Because 3 already is better, 4 is, but what's the point of spending a lot of money just repeating a study? Because whether I measure blood gas, electrolyte, the time the nurse takes to do the measurement is identical. It's just I get more results in 4 compared to 3.
Can I ask another one? How long does it take to actually train a nurse up to use these Proxima bits of kit?
We have a standard training program which takes between 60 and 90 minutes to train up a nurse. And after that, they're actually proficient. That is actually part of our CE marking. We have to prove that you can train a nurse and that the training afterwards is also effective. So this is our experience in the field as well as for the CE marking. We did some tests. So that gives you a rough idea. It's not too onerous. But again, it's like once you've learned it, you have to keep at it and not unlearn it again.
Can I just do one more?
Well, I think it's up.
Carry on, yes.
Okay. When are you actually going to... What's the delay in launching P4? I mean, it's there, it's approved. I mean, why not launch tomorrow?
Supply chain. Is you need to have product, all right? These things you don't manufacture them within a day or two. I mean, there's certain lead times you have to have from your suppliers, etc. So gearing up for launch is all about gearing up the supply chain so that we have, let's say, sufficient quantities to make sense to launch. I'm not going to have huge stocks piled up somewhere in a warehouse, but it is having sensible quantities so we actually can start using the product on patients.
And presumably the customers who took P3 will be first in line for P4, will they?
Potentially, yes. But we also have a few, especially pediatric centers, who are waiting for that because obviously they couldn't use Proxima 3 before, so they had to wait for Proxima 4. So I think in addition to the P3 customers, we also have a sort of a few interested parties lined up for pediatric use.
Thank you. Any other questions? I got some.
Yeah.
How many units do you expect to sell, in your first, perhaps, full year of sales?
I can say I refer to the research note on us and giving you an idea of, let's say, the revenue that we can think, and also in terms of the units. So I think on that, to be honest, let's say we're not talking about huge numbers.
No.
It is about going from pretty much zero to sort of a sensible first number, because what we want to do is we want to establish a good working base within hospitals and make sure that they use it on a routine basis, because that's what's going to drive the revenue. There's no point when you're trying to go wide very quickly and give it to a lot of people, and then they do it a few times and they stop using it. So we'd rather go for a sensible, slow approach, focusing on a few customers, get them up and running properly. And then, as you know, as the success grows, you can sort of add on it. And that's also by adding different distributors, you can then say, right, now I have more salespeople, I can address more customers. So by adding these distributors, we sort of tend to sort of build up the adoption curve.
Will that be UK focused to start with, just purely because of supply chain and obviously there's
No, I mean, currently we have people here in the UK, in Germany and Netherlands. That's where we have our direct sales people. So obviously they will get the product once it's launched. And at the same time, we will also make it available to the distributor in Italy that we already signed up. New distributors will have to wait a bit once we can actually then sort of provide the product to them.
Is that something you want to do in the future? Are you more of a research business, or are you actually a manufacturer and distributor? Where do you sit in this? Because we've seen a lot of companies in your position have done all the research, got product through phase 3 trials, but actually they're not a manufacturer, they're not a distributor. Are you
No, we are a commercial company.
You're commercial?
Yes.
So you will see it all the way
But
through.
what the important thing is we will not stop the R&D piece. I think it's important to understand that the product needs to evolve because there are more unmet needs out there which we want to capture. So we will not all of a sudden say, right, the product's done, it's only about selling. It's about ramping up the sales, being a commercial company at the same time, delivering those sort of product increments that I talked about.
Can you afford to hold back on some of the sales? I noticed on one of the slides you've got some requests like automation and all those sort of things, which I would have thought were quite important, and the graphical displays or the graphs. Quite important.
I think it says that the product, what we see on, is compelling enough that certain people will not wait for those things. Right. Other people might wait. So if you then have a sensible, let's say, time between now and actually bringing that to the market, then, for most of the people, by the time we sort of get a bigger group of adoption, that feature will be there already. Yeah. So it's about the early adopters typically understand that, products evolve over time. And they will not delay their decision as to, they want to start using it because they want to have the data, or they want to avoid the blood loss, or they're struggling with their nursing staff. That's the reason why they take the product, not because the graphical trend is not there yet. Okay. But again, if we have it, just makes it easier to use. So it's all about ease of use in the end.
Also, it'll probably be a higher price as well than that version. So
we'll see.
Any other questions, anybody?
Good evening. If you bought the Proxima 4, would you have to buy a completely new device for the update, or would you be able to update the system?
No, it's basically, it comes the monitor. I mean, I didn't talk about the system in a way. There's a monitor and there's a disposable piece. The monitor is actually a new piece of equipment. What we do is the people have 3. Nobody's bought the monitor. Everybody's using it on a sort of a rental basis. So what we do is we then just exchange the monitor for the new model. And the rest is just a disposable. I mean, you just open up a new packet and the next day it's 4, yesterday was 3. So it's very easy to change. There's no barrier. Because I know quite often in medical devices, people have invested hundreds of thousands of pounds, let's say, in terms of capital equipment. This is not the case for us.
Time for one more question, anybody? Gentleman back down here again. Thank you.
Wolfgang, I seem to recall in an earlier research note that they were suggesting that we'd need more funds to get to break even, and I think the figure was 10 million in the first one. I think that was £10 million. Given that you're being very frugal with your spend, would the analysts come up with the same number now, or might they reduce it?
Oh, we haven't spoken to the analysts yet. I think the one thing is, it's clear to get to break even, we will require additional cash. That's true. Whether that's the right amount or not, I think what we want to do is we want to spend as frugal as we can. We don't want to sort of overspend, especially on the R&D side. You can spend a lot of money working on stuff which in the end makes no difference I'm driven by, that's also why we had that feedback from the market, I'm driven by what does the customer actually want? And put that in the product. Not what your engineers think should be in the product, what the customer wants in the product, because that's going to sell, not the other one, right? That's why sort of, we need to understand that very carefully and then spend wisely. And I think that's why sort of, we'll see sort of what new research notes that will come up to understand, what the real amount is. Okay.
Thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you for your questions, everybody. Thank you.